Okay. From the beginning of the course, we have been talking a lot about this concept of institutions, and we've kept talking about institutions, institutional imagination, institutional alternatives, institutional reform. What we want to do today is just delve a little bit deeper into that concept of institutions, define what we mean by that term, discuss how the institutional underpinnings of an economy relate to how that economy functions, talk about different types of institutions and whether contemporary market economies depend on particular institutions or whether those institutions can take diverse forms. You've already, from this week's readings, you got some sense of the discussion. Obviously, Hall and Soskis on the one hand and Jamal and Robinson on the other are talking both about institutions, but in a very different kind of a way. What I hope today's discussion is going to do is provide a way of bridging these various approaches and also make clear how exactly we depart from the standard discussion on institutions. I'm going to give my version, and then Roberto will give his version while criticizing mine, and then we'll just discuss a little bit in our usual fashion. Today we talk broadly about market supporting institutions or the institutional underpinnings of a modern economy. In the next 3 or 4 weeks, we are going to be actually delving deeper, taking deeper dives into different sets of institutions, those that relate to financial markets, those that relate to labor markets, those that relate to issues of public finance and redistribution more directly, and those that relate to globalization or global economic arrangements. So those will be then more detailed discussions on different aspects of these questions in different kinds of domains before we bring it back up in the last couple of sessions on back to our core themes about how that discussion of institutions and institutional alternatives relate back to these questions about the knowledge economy, technological innovation, how we can envisage a more inclusive political economy. Now, in my remarks, I'm going to be focusing, again, sort of just to remind you that we have a kind of a foreground theme and a background theme. The foreground theme is largely substantive, about thinking about what to do in terms of just a general and a particular focus on different institutional arrangements. But there's a foreground theme about the role of economics. And in this discussion, I'm going to claim a role for economics in how we think about economics that's somewhat narrower than what economists usually believe in, but still a little bit broader than what I think Roberto is going to say, in the sense that I'm going to stake a claim for a positive contribution that economics can make to these discussions. But let me start with definitions. The simplest definition of an institution is probably also the best. That was given by the Nobel Prize-winning economic historian Douglass North, that economics are the rules of the game in a society. If you want a more intricate definition from Lynn and Nugent on institutions are a set of humanly devised behavioral rules, again rules, that govern and shape the interactions of human beings, in part by helping them form expectations of what other people will do. So this coordinating role of institutions is also very important. It helps us figure out how, not just sort of how we should behave, but how we expect others to behave as well. In that form, in that way, allow us to form mutual expectations and coordination. Institutions, as you know from this week's readings, of course, can be both formal and informal. That is, they can take the form of actual laws and regulations, written rules, or they can be informal in the sense of just being codes of conduct, norms, or patterns of behavior of sort of certain rules that we have internalized about how to behave, but are not necessarily written down. I'm going to give you some very specific examples later on. Again, a useful distinction when you think about institutions is not to confuse them with organizations. Institutions are different in the sense that they don't need to take kind of a physical shape. They are simply the rules. They need not be embodied in any kind of formal organization. The way that we think about institutions in economics is actually mostly usually absent. Certainly in textbook renditions of how a market operates, we think about firms, and we think about the firm's customers. The firms constitute the supply side. Customers constitute the demand side. And what we don't see, or what's implicit in the discussion, is that actually that relationship depends on a whole range of other institutions that allow this relationship to sustain itself and to thrive and to develop. So firms need access to infrastructure. They need access to skilled workers. They need to have a set of relation with the other firms that provide intermediate inputs or other sources of complementary goods. They need to access to financial markets, capital markets. They need to be able to borrow, to make use of credits. They need to, they're going to have a direct relationship with the government in the form that they usually are expected to pay taxes. Although if you're a very large and very rich firm these days, it's not so much. They need to be protected from predators, others who might prey on the firm, bandits, thieves. So they need to be protected from theft and expropriation. So these are all other kinds of implicit relationships that entail, that can ensure that the firm and the customer, the simple demand and supply relationship can actually coexist, but it's sort of, it's codependent on so many other things. And therefore, it depends on a very wide range of what one might call market supporting institutions, that in each one of these arrows, there's a set of rules that need to be enforced. Somebody needs to be engaged in training workers, in providing them with skills, education, to the extent that that is done through an educational system. The relationship of the firm with other firms, with its supplier, has to be regulated through various contracts, implicit or explicit, so there needs to be mechanisms of contract enforcement. The relationship of the firm with the creditors and the banks and the financial system has to be regulated through various banking securities laws, have to be regulated through bankruptcy procedures. Somebody has to provide the infrastructure, the roads, the transport, the electricity, the ports on which the firm relies. That requires investment infrastructure, the rules regarding with that. There has to be a tax administration to ensure the taxing occurs appropriately. Customers have to be protected from opportunistic behavior from firms through product safety standards and other agencies or other rules that protect firms from protect consumers from fraud. And finally, of course, the expropriation of the firm has to be, or theft against the firm has to be regulated through various property rights systems and more broadly kind of a political stability that ensures this happens. So when we think about this multitude of market supporting institutions, I find it useful to categorize what these institutions are under 4 different headings. And each one of these headings refers to a particular function that these institutions provide in order to ensure that an economy can operate adequately. First are the market-creating institutions, that we need a set of rules, a set of institutional arrangements that ensure that these markets are going to exist in the first place, and a minimal set of creating institutions would be institutions that enforce contract and ensure that property rights are appropriately defined. Okay? Secondly, we need to ensure that there are what I call market regulating institutions, that markets left to their own do not always produce the kind of Smithian ideal of ensuring that everyone gets their due and we have a thriving economy. Markets can fail because of lack of competition, because of abuse of market power, because of externalities, because of various concerns about distributive effects of markets. So therefore, we need a whole range of other institutional arrangements under this heading of market regulating institutions, such as competition policies, antitrust, regulations, environmental and safety, various labor market institutions that regulate how labor relates to capital in the process of production, and also the correction of a wide range of product market failures that might arise from coordination failures or other product market or learning externalities that we'll talk about a little bit later, we've already referred to, so these industrial policies. Third, markets need institutions that ensure that they're not a source of instability, that they actually produce a certain amount of stable outcome. These are what I call market stabilizing institutions. You might want to think about these as institutions that ensure the macroeconomy behaves appropriately. So if market regulating institutions deal with microeconomic imperfections or microeconomic problems, market stabilizing institutions are those that would ensure that the aggregate market stability is appropriately managed. These are, of course, our sort of monetary, fiscal, currency, financial, prudential regulations that ensure financial and macroeconomic stability. Finally, there's a heading there which I've called market legitimizing institutions. After all, markets operate in broader societal and political arrangements, and we're concerned not just about their economic consequences, but we're concerned about their consistency with societal norms, societal expectations about fairness, distributive justice, appropriate equity and inclusion, and therefore there are other institutions in which all modern contemporary markets are embedded in, which are these market legitimizing institutions, at the very least a certain amount of provision of redistribution, social insurance, and you could even think about one of the purposes of political democracy is to ensure that it gives ordinary people a sense of control over their economic destinies, that they actually ensure that markets are embedded in a broader political community that in turn determines what those rules are, consistent with the values and beliefs and expectations of individuals. Now, those are all sort of standard classic functions of market supporting institutions. We may want to think about how they would extend to the new economy, the knowledge economy, to context where many of these new technological processes that we have discussed in previous sessions are now becoming embedded, at least in parts of the economy that we would hope would extend throughout the rest of the economy. Here, we've distinguished in previous sessions between kind of this traditional mass production model and what we might call a model of continuous innovation. These have very different implications about about the nature of the firm, about the nature of work and labor relations, and the nature of relationships among firms. And so the institutional requirements, therefore, would also be very different. I'm not going to summarize what's in each one of these cells, because there are in many ways things that we've already talked about when we talk about the nature of the knowledge economy, the nature of these new technologies. But obviously, the set of labor market institutions that would be required when in conditions of mass production, where there's basically everybody's operating in a factory system where work consists of routine, repetitive, manual, standalone kind of work, would be very different when we ask the question, what should the labor market institutions look like in a kind of a technological environment where, in fact, work takes the form of much more of is adaptive, constantly adapting, is much more craft-like, based much more on cognitive work rather than manual work, based on collaborative teamwork, and is much more skill and capital intensive. So this switch in the way that we need to think about institutions, some of those elements have already come out in previous discussions, but it's a dimension that we need to bear in mind. So this new system of the knowledge economy or the modern new technologies are going to have different institutional prerequisites in these different domains of generation of knowledge and new technology, increasing skills and endowment, and the various supportive institutions that ensure that the ecosystem within which firms and labor markets arrangements develop under these new techniques are adequately developing. So remember, let me remind you again and emphasize that when I presented you with this typology, fourfold typology of what kind of institutions an economy requires or a market system requires, I said that this is a kind of a functional typology. That is that each one of these headings describes what is the function that good institutions must perform. When we think about institutions, and in particular when we think about institutional change, institutional reform, we often make the mistake of associating those functions with a particular form or with a particular design. So for example, we might think about contract enforcement. So contract enforcement is a kind of institutional function for these good institutional arrangements. We might think that contract enforcement necessarily requires a system where sort of very clear rules, laws, and legislation that is then enforced through a system of courts. But when we look around the world, we actually see many, many different types of contract enforcement. There's an alternative, for example, that's called relational contracts, which actually don't rely on any formal legal regimes or third-party enforcement through courts, but often work just as well. And the manner in which contract enforcement is maintained in these relational contracting environments is through repeated interaction and trust building on the part of different types of firms. And these contracts are enforced not by relying on the police power of the court or the states, but they are enforced through the implicit threat that if one of the parties consistently departs from the expectations, that relationship is going to break down. And since both parties have a stake in continuing the relationship, these repeated game incentives can sustain this kind of contract enforcement over time without necessarily relying on the police power of the state. So that's just one example of the possibility that you might have contract enforcement provided through a set of different types of institutional arrangements. Similarly, we might think that if one of the objectives of good institutional arrangements is to provide incentives to private parties to invest, we might think that the best set of institutional arrangements that would provide those incentives would be a system of free markets or deregulated markets, removing price controls, removing the state from the markets. But that, again, would be a kind of a misleading inference to the extent that when we look around the world, we find many, many different set of arrangements that have been able to crowd in private investment without necessarily anything approaching free markets or deregulated markets. China, of course, is a perfect example of that. Now, it is true that, of course, you can have a system where the state or the state institutions are so overbearing that they're going to crowd out private investment completely. But it is simply not true that you just need to have a completely deregulated or free market regime to provide the optimum scale of incentives for the private sector to invest. One can run through the kinds of example that you might think that macroeconomic stability requires independent central banks, but it's not. Independent central banks are certainly not the only institutional framework for macroeconomic management that's going to provide for macroeconomic stability. So the trouble when we think about institutional alternative, institutional reform, is going to be that while we're pretty good at being able to define what the functions, what the institutional desiderata are, we are not going to be generally good at mapping them towards the kinds of institutional forms that work in a particular local setting. Because the appropriate institutional settings are so context specific, interact in such complicated ways with history and culture, that we might have a lot of difficulty in figuring out how particular objectives, such as inducing the private sector to invest or providing appropriate contract enforcement, how that is actually best implemented, what kind of designs will best implement that in a local setting. And what works in one setting is obviously not going to work elsewhere. And this problem that these institutional functions do not map uniquely into specific forms, I think, is the fundamental dilemma of institutional change and institutional alternatives. It is also one way you can think about what the role of institutional imagination is, which is precisely thinking about what those alternatives are, informed by but not constrained, informed but not constrained by the kinds of institutions that exist somewhere else. So I'm just going to now give you one of my favorite examples that capture some of these many things. And this is actually an example from traffic. So let me start with, is this in over here? No, here, okay. So this is Hanoi. Okay. So what does a traffic system need to do? It needs to coordinate the behavior of so many different people who are all coming into this intersection. There are the bikes, pedestrians, the bus, cars, trucks, right? And why do you need rules? Because in the absence of rules, they'd be all running into each other, or the whole intersection will be completely clogged. Okay. Now here you see a case where, in fact, in the traffic, the traffic is moving. This is another example of the thing. So the traffic is moving. There are no accidents. It's moving slowly, but it's moving. But there are actually no formal rules because you don't see a traffic cop. You don't see actually traffic lights in the intersection. So the kind of formal rules that you associate with a traffic intersection aren't there. But that doesn't mean that there are no rules because obviously the people who are crossing have internalized a certain set of rules about what you do, right? And the fact that there are such rules, you can figure out by introspection if you ask yourself, if you were a person who had never been to Hanoi or a similar kind of intersection before, think of yourself as the typical American who just finds himself or herself in that intersection for the first time, and you'd be totally paralyzed. You would be completely unable to cross that street. And then that's why you need those kinds of the next kind of videos as to tips to cross the street in Vietnam, because those are completely rules that others have internalized. So the rules do exist. There is an institution, but it's informal. But that others who have not internalized those rules are at a handicap. Now, I think about this Vietnam example in relationship to the relational contracting example that I gave a minute ago, which is precisely how firms traditionally have related to other firms in Vietnam, because the court system is so weak that firms in Vietnam typically have relied not on third-party enforcement, but through relational contracting, these informal arrangements with other firms. And that sort of is an analogy to this kind of traffic arrangement that once again, you don't have what matters are not the formal rules. In fact, the formal rules don't exist, but that doesn't mean that traffic or the economy doesn't operate. In fact, the Vietnamese economy has done extremely well under this very informal system of relational contracting. Now you might say, well, why not just have best practices? Here are some best practices for you, where actually there is an intersection where we have traffic lights. This is in St. Petersburg. So there are formal rules. There are traffic lights, but it's obviously not very safe. It doesn't work very well. Here's a case of sort of a set of traffic rules that are not very, very effective. So I'm going to stop this because it's obvious what's going to happen. It gets worse and worse. So what's going wrong in the St. Petersburg example is not just that some people are violating the rules. It's also that others are not sufficiently taking into account that some people might be violating the rules. So there's this role of coordination there. So if everybody knew that others are violating the rules, in other words, running through the red lights, because there are formal rules, there's a red light. If everybody took into account that there is some proportion of drivers who will just cross through a red light, will go through a red light, then you would slow down. And the accidents are created by the expectations that when you see a green light, you just assume everybody else will stop at a red light. And that's what's failing. It's the failure of the coordination function that's most obviously failing here in the case of the Russian case. And I use Russia as a comparison to Vietnam because in many ways Russia made the transition in the 1990s to a kind of a Western-style court-enforced system of property rights contract enforcement. And in many ways, that sort of Western-type best practices proved much less adept in Russia in producing private investment and economic activity, precisely because those courts did not function very well. They were ineffective, inefficient, and often corruptible. So this simply just taking on this best practices, this Western-style institution, did not work very well. So the one way of summarizing this and this multiplicity of institutional forms is certainly with respect to the economic domain, thinking about a kind of a thought exercise of the following kind, which is to say, well, let's first define what are the objectives that we want market-supporting institutions to do. Well, one thing we want them to do is to ensure that there is productive efficiency, that resources are used efficiently, and that means just not statically, but also dynamically over time. That means that people have adequate incentive to invest in the right kinds of areas. And we can ask, are there a sort of universal principles that are associated when we think about what are some of these sort of broader principles to ensure that these appropriate objectives are fulfilled? So I can say, yeah, I mean, property rights have to be well defined. And what I mean by property rights is exactly that to ensure potential and current investors can retain the returns to their investment. So that's a minimal description of property rights. That incentives must be appropriately aligned. And what do I mean by that? That producer incentives must be aligned with social costs and benefits. In other words, when producers are deciding how much to produce, who to employ, how much to invest, they're taking into account at the margin the full account of the social costs and benefits that they generate. And there needs to be a certain amount of predictability or rule of law, that things aren't changing always constantly, and that you have some you can see ahead of you. So you can say these are universal in the sense that that falling short of one of these principles is going to create some adverse effect on the objective that you're seeking. But they're essentially content-free to the extent that they don't actually tell you what is it that you need to do to achieve those outcomes. So all the interesting policy questions, interesting questions about institutional design are really in the third column, where we need to think about. So there's a huge diversity of sort of plausible institutional arrangements about the types of property rights that we should have, about the type of legal regime that we should have, what is the right balance between decentralized competition versus collaborative production, what types of financial institutions, corporate governance we should have, and so forth. Those are all questions that are up for grab, that are not fully determined by the requirements, the universal principles in the second column. Similarly, in the macroeconomic domain, we might say that we have objectives of macroeconomic and financial stability, that there's a set of universal principles that are important, that we need to ensure that we maintain policies of sound money. And what I mean by sound money is not some arch conservative principle of zero inflation or price stability at all costs. What I mean is that we have a process through which liquidity is generated in a way that the supply of liquidity does not go considerably beyond the increase in nominal money demand. Or the concept of fiscal sustainability, once again, is not necessarily just an arch conservative principle of austerity. It just means that you want to conduct your fiscal policies in a way that public debt does not explode, does not keep on growing beyond national aggregates of production. Similarly, the sort of prudential regulation, you might have seen that could have been part of the previous slide, in the sense of ensuring that the incentives of financial lenders and borrowers are fully aligned with social costs and benefits at the margin, in particular that they do not take excessive risk. But these universal principles don't map into unique institutional design, unique institutional solutions, and therefore we have, again, all these sort of open questions about how independent should a central bank be? Should capital accounts be closed, regulated, open? Should there be independent fiscal institutions that enforce rule-bound fiscal policies, or should there be fiscal discretion? What is the size of the public economy? Should we have the state collect 20% of taxes or 45% of the taxes? None of these is determined by these broader principles. Third, and very briefly, in the domain of distributive justice and poverty alleviation, you might think that we have certain principles, such as principle of targeting, the principle of universality, the principle of incentive compatibility, that are broad principles that don't fully define, don't necessarily produce very determinate conclusions about what the shape that social programs or tax systems ought to take. So where I think the contribution of economics often is in being able to draw certain connections between the second column and the desirability of different kinds of arrangements in the third column in a particular contextual setting. Okay? So that's when I think the economics might be the most useful. Economics does not determine the answer to the third questions on its own, but it provides a set of tools that allows us to travel from the second to the third column using a lot of additional information beyond what the economics provides. And that additional information comes from history. It comes from an analysis of politics. It comes from the insertion of certain norms and values and preferences that we want to think about when we design these institutions. But those are much helped by thinking in terms of the various tools that economics provides in terms of thinking about incentives, thinking about how markets work, thinking about aggregates, thinking about unintended consequences, and so forth. So I'm not going to be able to, therefore, given what I've said, just say that we have a very, very deliberate, very clear-cut set of principles about how we do institutional reform, how do we change institutions, how do we think about institutional alternatives. But when I think about these questions, some of the things that I try to keep in mind are what's on this final slide, that we need to take into account the institutions that exist elsewhere. Sometimes they're called best practices. So we need to consider them, but not blindly copy them. That we need to keep in mind what these higher order principles or the universal principles are. Which objectives are we serving, and are there some universal principles that are a stepping stone from those objectives to the particular designs that we will consider. Where possible, I would say, rather than assuming that you start from a blank slate, we take the institutions that already exist and try to build on them. At the same time, as we've been emphasizing throughout, that we will need to deploy imagination and creativity to be able to move in different directions as well. We need to experiment, but experiment with purpose. And what that means is that we need to discipline our experimentation. We start with a set of provisional targets about what is it that we're trying to achieve. We put in place mechanisms through which we can actually monitor outcomes. And monitoring outcomes requires that we have clear-cut targets against which we're monitoring our progress. We have mechanisms to ensure that we're actually learning from our monitoring. And then we have a capacity to revise either the targets if they prove under or over ambitious, or that we can actually revise the rules, the set of practices on which we have started on. One very important contribution of thinking in these terms about institutions and institutional change is that it provides, it sort of undercuts the usual kind of objection to institutional reform, which is that we have such weak institutions that what is it that we can do? This way of thinking about institutions it tells you that we should not despair about weak institutions. And in particular, when institutional reform becomes a strong priority, the evidence around the world is that very strong institutions can be built. My best example of that are the independent central banks, which is that central banks were universally known around the world as being extremely weak institutions up through the 1970s. In the early 1980s, we caught the disinflation bug. Disinflation becomes such an important objective that even the poorest country was able to put in place independent or quasi-central independent central banks, professionally managed and so forth, producing very low inflation. Often it's a question of being very clear about the objectives and putting priorities on that. Okay? So let me just stop here, and we'll turn to Roberto.
So I will address the fabulous topic of institutions in a fashion that both complements and contradicts what Danny Roderick has just said in the spirit of our earlier exchanges. So I want to begin with the definition of institutions and then return at the end to the general way of thinking about institutions, and in the middle address the treatment of institutions in economic theory. So what are institutions? I propose a definition somewhat different from Danny's. Institutions are the norms, rules, standards, and normative attitudes that govern practice in a particular domain of social life, informed by a conception of what relations among people in that domain can and should be like. Now, the most important implication of this definition is negative. Institutions are not things. They are not thing-like. And their attributes all have to do, their most important attributes, with this difference between institutions and things. So first, institutional arrangements are always mediated by representations, by ideas. And in particular, ideas about what the relations among people can and should be like in a particular part of social life. Our ideals and interests are always nailed to the cross of our institutions and practices, and the law is the site of this crucifixion. The law is the institutional form of the life of a people, represented in relation to the ideals and interests that make sense of it. The second attribute of institutions and of the ideological representations with which they are always associated is that they tilt the scales of experience in a particular direction. Now, the best way to explain this idea is to explain it by contrast to a dominant idea in both liberal political thinking and in economics. So in liberal political thinking, it is the aspiration to form a framework of rights that is neutral with respect to sectarian visions of the good. The contrast between the impersonal right and the sectarian good is one of the most fundamental assumptions of liberal political thinking. It is untenable. Every institutional order tilts the scales of experience, encouraging some forms of experience and discouraging others. There is no neutral framework, ever. And the idea of neutrality is dangerous because it is always invoked in defense of its opposite. That is, in the course of an attempt to entrench a particular organization of social life and to insulate it against challenge and change. Nevertheless, the false and dangerous idea of neutrality has a kinship with a legitimate and indispensable idea. We want the structure, that is to say, the institutional and ideological order of society, to be open to a wide range of alternatives and of contradiction, and above all, to be corrigible in the light of experience. Openness and corrigibility are the legitimate counterparts to the false and dangerous ideal of neutrality. The third characteristic of institutions is that they are artifacts. We made them. And because we made them, we can understand them, as Vico suggested already in the late 18th century, in the way in which the creator understands his creations. Not from outside, as we understand natural phenomena, but from inside. So one way to think is this: what are these structures, these institutional and ideological regimes? They're a kind of frozen fighting, a kind of frozen politics if we understand politics in the large sense of conflict over the terms of our relations to one another. There's a struggle, practical and visionary struggle, and this struggle is temporarily interrupted and contained. And the structures are what result from this temporary containment. So imagine, as a metaphor, a game of musical chairs. The music stops, we sit down on the chairs. The chairs are the law, the detailed form of the institutions. Now, there is a fourth characteristic of institutions that follows directly from this third attribute. And the fourth characteristic is that institutions, as our artifact, our creation, don't exist univocally. They exist more or less. They can be organized to insulate themselves against challenge and change. And when they are organized in this way, they appear to us as if they were part of the furniture of the universe, as if they were natural phenomena, when in fact they are just our creations. And then we mistake them, we fail to understand them as what they are, what Marx and Hegel described as the alienated parts of ourselves. But we can also organize them in such a way that they facilitate their own revision in the light of experience. And when they are organized in this way, we can, to a greater extent, engage in them without surrendering to them, and we can be insiders and outsiders at the same time. And our greatest material and moral interests are connected with this attempt to transform the quality or character as well as the content of institutions. Now I come to the second part of my remarks, the debate about institutions in economics. And what is the most important debate? The most important debate is the debate about the institutional form of the market economy itself. Now, in the 19th century, there was a predominant belief, which was shared by the Marxists and by the conservative jurists. And the belief was that the market order had a built-in legal and institutional content. A society might choose to be such an order, or it might evolve into such an order, but it didn't have a choice about the content of that order. It was a package. You bought the package, or the package was given to it, and then you had to open the package. It had a content which it was not yours to choose. So this is the Marxist conception of capitalism. Capitalism is a system, and it has a predefined legal and institutional architecture. And that premise was the same premise of conservative legal science in the 19th century. The jurists had this idea that the market order, the scheme of ordered liberty, was a system, and the project of legal science was to unpack it in its legal details. But something remarkable happened, which was when they set out to vindicate this idea, to implement it in their analytical practice, they discovered the opposite. That when you tried to determine the legal and institutional architecture of the market economy, inferring it from abstract conceptions of private property and freedom to contract, and then going down the ladder of concreteness, at each rung down this ladder, there were choices to be made. For example, how you should organize the relations or the rights between neighbors, control of water, upstream or downstream. And it was never possible, the jurists discovered, to infer the answer to these questions by inference from the abstract conception of the market. There were always alternatives. Alternative ways to organize a market order as you descended down the ladder of concreteness. And these alternatives turned on contests among interests and among visions. They could not be logically inferred from the abstract idea of a market. That was the proposition famously associated in the United States with some of the most influential jurists like Oliver Wendell Holmes, and in Germany with their counterparts like Rudolf von Jhering. And it was the main analytical achievement of legal theory in the period between the middle of the 19th century and the middle of the 20th century, to demonstrate that the market has no single natural and necessary legal form. Now, the same idea, the same fundamental idea that a market order can be organized in radically different ways, with radically different consequences, not just for distributive advantage, but for the organization of production and exchange, could already be inferred even at the most abstract level, even at the top of the ladder. Take the idea of a market in its most abstract form. Even in that most abstract form, it has at least two aspects. One aspect is the absolute level of economic decentralization. That is to say, the number of economic agents who are entitled to bargain on their own initiative and for their own account. The second aspect has to do with the absoluteness of the control that each of these agents enjoys over the resources at his command. Is it an unconditional control? Is it eternal? Can it be transmitted through the hereditary transmission of property? The unified property right, vesting all the component powers of property in a single right holder, the owner, was an invention of the 19th century. It is not the normal form of property. The normal form of property in legal history, in the common law tradition, in the civil law tradition, in all the major legal traditions of the world, is that the component powers of ownership are disaggregated and vested in different tiers of right holders. The 19th century unification of property was an anomaly. And then the right of property became the paradigmatic form of rights in general in legal political theory, in legal political and economic theory. So the degree of control that each agent enjoys at the resources at his command can be fragmentary, relative, limited, and temporary. The idea of conservative political and economic thinking is that these two aspects of the abstract conception of the market order, the absolute level of decentralization and the absoluteness of the control, go together, but they obviously don't go together. There's no necessary relation between them. And in fact, the first can be advanced by limiting the second. That is, it might be possible to increase the level of absolute economic decentralization by limiting the absoluteness of the property right and by forming claims to productive resources that are temporary, fragmentary, or conditional. Now, there's nothing mysterious about that. That happens all the time in legal history. For example, contemporary financial markets or markets in so-called financial derivatives, which are derivatives of the property right, options contract, puts and calls. It's just that this principle of the disaggregation of the property right has not been radicalized or generalized as a principle of design of an alternative market order. Now I come to a third step in my argument. How then has economics approached, in general, the problem of institutions, and in particular the problem of the institutional form of the market itself, which is the most important institutional problem for economics? From the standpoint of institutional imagination, you could say that there are three main forms of economics. The first is what you could call pure economics. It was the economics originally envisioned by the marginalist theoreticians of the 19th century and achieved in consummate analytic form by the general equilibrium theoreticians of the mid-20th century. It has no institutional assumptions or implications. It is free of any institutional message. It is a form of logic, an analytic apparatus. And in the mid-20th century, the debates about so-called market socialism, led by economists like Oskar Lange and Aber Lerner, demonstrated that the marginalist apparatus could be applied without insuperable difficulty even to a command economy. And the choice among institutional forms was a political choice, a choice motivated by values or causal conjectures, nothing that could be arbitrated by the pure science of economics. The second style of economics, with respect to the problem of institutions and of the institutional form of the market economy, is what you could call fundamentalist economics. So the assumption of fundamentalist economics is that the market order does have a single natural and necessary legal and institutional form. Precisely the idea that the jurists for the last 100 or 150 years have subverted, even against their own intentions. So I mentioned this in an earlier discussion we had. It's the idea of a certain kind of Hayekian, that if Robinson Crusoe traded on his island long enough, he would eventually reproduce the whole system of 19th century German private law. As if the market order had a natural form. Now then there's the third position. The third position is what we could label equivocating economics. And it is exemplified by the position of the American followers of Keynes in the second half of the 20th century, who rendered his doctrines palatable and actionable by downsizing them, by defanging them of their distressing political elements. So what this equivocating economics does is the following. It seeks to establish law-like correlations among large-scale economic aggregates, such as the level of inflation and of employment. That's what was known as the Phillips curve. And it pursues a whole series of these supposedly law-like correlations. Then someone comes and challenges this idea and says, these correlations depend on a detailed institutional background. The background is not some abstract proposition like capitalism or the market economy. It depends on the details. For example, is there unemployment insurance? How much is it and how is it paid? How are the workers organized? What is the organization of monetary policy and who has power over it, and so forth. If any part of this institutional and legal background changes, the regularities fall apart. So if you then present this challenge, the equivocating economist says, by what the lawyers call confession and demurrer, he concedes and says, yes. But de facto, in fact, if we are in a historical situation in which the institutional background is stagnant, he can disregard this concession in his analytical and argumentative practice and go back to what he was doing before. Now that's what happens. And it's not restricted to economics. Let me give you an analogy in physics and cosmology. So we know now, and we do know ever since the 1920s, that the fundamental constituents of nature, as they are described by the standard model of particle physics, and the laws, symmetries, and constants of nature, as they are described by fundamental physics, could not have prevailed at the earliest moments of the present universe. They only apply in the cool-down universe that we inhabit. But the dominant paradigms of contemporary physics, relativity and quantum mechanics, emerged just before the discovery of the historical character of the universe. And so what the physicist does in his argumentative and analytical practice is to confuse stability or stagnation with lawfulness. Exactly the same thing that the equivocating economist does on his lesser scale. So these are the three main types of thinking in economics about institutions, and all of them represent evasions of the imperative of understanding the structures, the institutional and ideological structures. They're all inadequate. And we cannot remedy the inadequacies of any one of them by appealing to the other two. Now then, I come to the third stage of my argument. And before dealing with the universal principles that Danny put there on the screen as a proposed solution to this problem, I want to place this confusion about the institutions and more generally about institutional and ideological structures in the context of the history of ideas. So it's not just economics. It's our entire understanding of society and history that is confused. And in a nutshell, the history of thinking about structures could be retold in the following way. Classical European social theory as exemplified by Marxism, had a structural idea. It distinguished the surface of social life from the deep structure, the formative institutional and ideological context, the regime that shaped the routines and the conflicts by which in a society we determine the future within the present. And it understood that the structures of society are not natural phenomena, as I said at the outset. We made them. They are made and imagined. They are our creations. But it surrounded this revolutionary insight with a series of deterministic assumptions or illusions that corrupted the insight. So in Marxism, the most influential theory, there are three main such illusions. The first is that there is in history a closed list of basic regimes. These are the modes of production in Marx: feudalism, capitalism, socialism. The second illusion is that each of these is an indivisible system. So this has practical consequences of great significance. It means that there are basically only two kinds of politics: the binary idea of politics, the reformist management of a system, or the revolutionary substitution of one system by another. And it excludes what is in fact the main form of structural change in history, which is change that is structural but piecemeal. And the third assumption is that there are laws governing the foreordained succession of these systems in history. We don't have to have a project because history has a project for us. All of these assumptions are false. And even those who use the vocabulary that was developed on the basis of these assumptions find it impossible to believe in them. William James said, people believe everything they can, but they can't believe this. And so there's this confusion. Now then, what happens in contemporary social science and policy discourse? It has abolished the structural idea altogether. So it's discarded these deterministic illusions, but only at the cost of also discarding the revolutionary insight. And its whole tendency is to naturalize the established arrangements, to present them as the outcome of a narrowing evolutionary funnel toward best practice, what works. And each social science does this in a different way. We'll discuss later more fully the way in which economics performs this movement of mystification. So that's where we are. We have no usable idea of structure, of structural change, of structural discontinuity, of structural alternatives in history. This kind of ground zero of thinking about structure. Now I come to the fourth part of the argument, and I address Danny's proposal about these universal principles. So how are we to understand these universal principles in relation to the categories that I just proposed? So we could say it's an attempt to find a middle ground between pure economics, which is rigorous but institutionally empty, and fundamentalist or equivocating economics, which has institutional content on the basis of illusion and mystification. So one is pure but impotent, and the other is powerful but corrupted. And so it's this idea of the middle ground. And more in particular, the function of these universal principles, I suggest, is to take something off the table Now, off the table of what? Off the table of controversy. So, what goes on in history in the real world? It's a struggle over alternative directions of policy, over alternative forms of organization. And in this struggle, there's always a mixture of causal ideas, ideas about how things work and how they change in the economy, and what causes what, and programmatic orientations. And so the idea is that there's a bedrock of guides, of sensible guides of economic rationality that we can take off the table of these controversies. Well, can we? So my thesis is that we can't. Now, there are two aspects to this problem. One aspect is, does the world, in fact, take them off the table of these controversies? The answer to that question is no. The world doesn't. The world is stubborn. The world refuses to receive this light from economic science. The second question is the world ill-advised to be stubborn? And the answer to that question is also no. The world is right to resist. And just very briefly, I want to give some examples without the more complete discussion that these principles would deserve. So let's begin with the first chapter there of productive efficiency. Yeah, it might be useful. Productive efficiency. So, and let me focus on there the first and the third, property rights and rule of law. Ensure potential and current investors can retain the returns of their investments. Provide a transparent, stable, and predictable set of rules. Well, who could disagree with that? But in fact, the world disagrees with that and has every reason to disagree with that when we enter into the details. So look at the property rights and the rule of law, as it were, downstream in the implementation after the property rights and the rules have been defined. In every major economic transition, the enclosure movement in England in the late Middle Ages, or the development of China in the middle of the 20th century. What we see, the historians tell us, is a differential mastery or understanding of the legal rules, the rules about property. So there are the rules, they're supposedly universal, but some groups and some classes understand them, manipulate them better than others. Some are unable to use them and others are. And there's a redistribution. So for example, take the colonial historians of Burma. The English law is implanted. The Chinese moneylenders understand the law, and the subsistence peasant farmers don't and aren't able to use it. And there is then a violent redistribution from the second group to the first, which serves the purpose of, quote, capitalist development. It's the differential advantage, which is the dynamic. And it's the same idea that already Marx adumbrates in his historical discussions in Capital. Now look upstream, before the property rights are defined, or in the definition of the property rights. Who will have property? And what will be the benefits that will accrue to property? Here, as described, the returns to their investments. Well, every regulation, almost every regulation, every tax of corporate profits or of the capital gains and dividends of the underlying shareholders is a dispute, is the result of a dispute about these returns to investment. How much should they be expropriated, and in what way? With radical differences. And should only the so-called investors be remunerated, or also the stakeholders, for example, the workers, from whose work the product resulted? There is a branch of law called the law of restitution or of unjust enrichment in private law that governs the degree to which and the occasions on which people should be compensated if they do some action which enriches others, even though it's not the result of contract or of an employment. And on that principle, we could imagine that there would be a redistribution in society. How much? Well, that's the stuff of modern politics. And it's impossible to take it off the table in the way that this principle proposes. Now let's go to the next section, macroeconomic and financial stability, the sound money policy. Do not generate liquidity beyond the increase in nominal money demand at reasonable inflation. Well, the right wing in politics and in economics has never agreed with that. So that was the defense of the gold standard. And what they have said and did say and have said for over 100 years is that the only effective way to ensure this, to achieve this objective is to have a metallic base for money. The Polish economist Kalecki, a Marxist economist, made the remark that the function of the gold standard was to make the level of economic activity depend on the level of business confidence. In other words, to tie the hands of national governments and to prevent them from embarking on nationalist and populist adventures. And this principle of sound money, from their perspective, is simply the expression of the so-called neoclassical synthesis in economics. Keynesian economics, downsized, redubbed macroeconomics as the theory of fiscal and monetary policy, and superimposed on the untransformed body of marginalist economic theory, redubbed microeconomics. So what started out as being two rival paradigms of economic theory have become two chapters in the same textbook. Now, from a different perspective, from the perspective of progressives or critics, you could say this principle of sound money is a principle for a world that no longer exists. That was the world of the late 20th century. Expansionary fiscal and monetary policy, inflation, the Phillips curve as the lever with which central banks would influence the real economy. All of that is broken. None of that exists. So now we have a world that is, in some respects, is closer to the world that Keynes wrote about. large pools of liquid capital, hoarding, underinvestment, what was called at that time the liquidity trap. And this principle of sound money doesn't apply. So we need a different way of thinking. In that different way of thinking, one characteristic would be that from time to time, we would appeal to heterodox instruments with which to raise the level of nominal money demand. For example, what has been called long-time asset purchases by the central banks, the so-called quantitative easing, or negative interest rates. And the second attribute is that we couldn't make sense of what the problem is or what to do without having a view of the supply side of the economy. So it doesn't make sense to have a principle that relates only to the demand side. Now, this idea has obviously penetrated even the conventional economic thinking because, for example, the Federal Reserve Act that governs the Federal Reserve, as amended in 1977, Section 2A, says that the aim of the central bank, of the Federal Reserve, should be to maintain the long-run growth of the monetary and credit aggregates commensurate with the economy's long-run potential to increase production. I have no idea who came up with that one. But they certainly weren't people who were restricted to the economic textbooks, because anyone formed in that tradition would have objected right at the outset, what's production? And here the idea of sound money appears only as an intermediate variable. The controlling goal is the increase of production, a productivist idea, entirely foreign to the sound money principle. Now we come to the last chapter, distributive justice and poverty alleviation. Targeting and universality. Now, a lawyer might say right at the outset, they're like principle and counter-principle in law. They're in tension. And that's a way not to have any principle, to have the principle and the counter-principle. So targeting. So should the redistributive programs in social spending be targeted to the most needy? Well, that seems obvious. But that's exactly what the European Social Democrats rejected. And it's what Franklin Roosevelt rejected in the New Deal, universal principles. Now, it's not just to maximize political support. It's an idea. It's a normative idea that we can all be lifted up only by universal principles. In Lyndon Johnson's presidency, there was a fateful turn in the war on poverty to these targeted programs, which broke with this social democratic or Rooseveltian principle, addressed just to the poor, supposedly to the benefit of the poor, but it turned out, in fact, to be against them. Because we know then that we break the principle of universality, and we create a situation in which, in downturns of the political and economic cycle, the benefits can be turned off or downsized. It's not just a utilitarian notion of buying political support. It's a social compact with a normative content of universality, which is to be maintained. That's the dispute. So these universal principles. The world doesn't want them. The world resists. The world is right to resist. This intermediate level doesn't exist. You know, Thomas Carlyle dubbed economics the dismal science. And the idea is it's the science of constraints and trade-offs. It presents the bill. So it comes to us, it gives us the bill. We're daydreaming. The bill collector knocks on the door and he gives the bill. And as we're stunned looking at the bill collector takes advantage of our distraction and shoves a straitjacket on us. It's not an old-time straitjacket like the 19th century straitjacket. It's a modern straitjacket, flexible, but it's a straitjacket. And those are the universal principles, which we have every reason to tear apart, as the world does. So now I come then to the last step of my argument. And one is just say something by way of thinking about institutions in general. So the first thing, and everything I'm going to say, I'm going to propose 5 theses. And all of them, except for the third, span the gap between economic and political theory. They're inclusive. They have to be to make sense. So the first has to do with our relation to a central idea in the economic and political theory of the past. An idea shared by liberals and leftists. So the 19th century idea is that there was a predetermined harmony, a pre-established harmony, a natural convergence between the institutional requirements for the development of our productive powers, what Marx called the forces of production, and the institutional requirements for our liberation from entrenched schemes of social division and hierarchy, and especially the class structures of modern societies. So the same rights, the same rules, the same institutions would liberate us from both. That was the dogmatic conception of the 19th century liberals and socialists. Now, we can no longer believe in those dogmas, and we risk being seduced by the inversion of these dogmas to a dogmatic pessimism of believing that there is an insoluble contradiction between the institutional requirements for our development of our productive powers and the institutional requirements for our liberation from these entrenched schemes of hierarchy. That would be equally unreasonable. And the idea is that there is some zone of potential overlap. There is some subset of the institutional requirements for the development of our productive powers that satisfies our moral aims, and some subset of the institutional requirements of our moral aims that satisfies our material aspirations. And it is in that zone of intersection or overlap that we must advance, seeking to find its institutional content in our particular historical circumstance. The second idea is that the focus of ideological controversy, especially ideological controversy about institutions in the world, is changing. Over the last 250 years, the dominant model of ideological controversy was the market against the state. More market, less state. More state, less market. Synthesis of market and state. Social democracy or social liberalism. Now we see the emergence in the world of a different focus of ideological controversy. The alternative forms of economic, political, and social pluralism. The alternative institutional arrangements for a market order, for democratic politics, and for an independent civil society. And on this view of the new controversy, the arrangements that exist in the world that are established, especially in the rich North Atlantic countries, are a subset of a much wider range of institutional possibilities. And the solution to all the structural problems of contemporary societies depends on our traveling in other parts of that set, not in this narrow subset. The third idea, and this is the idea that is more narrowly economic and closely connected with the agenda of our course, is that we have a special interest in the deepening and diffusion of the most advanced practice of production in our historical circumstance. Now it's the knowledge economy. The most advanced practice is the practice that's closest to the imagination. It's the practice that connects most intimately our experiments in the transformation of nature with our experiments in the transformation of how we cooperate with one another. And now, bring the imagination into power in the economy. So that's one great project. And in the democratizing the market order in the service of this diffusion of the market economy, its counterparts in politics are a high-energy democracy that diminishes the dependence of change on crisis, and in education, a form of education that forms the capable individual able to resist his context as well as to operate within it. The fourth idea, the fourth thesis, picks up on one of the attributes of institutions that I mentioned at the outset, that they don't exist univocally, they exist more or less. They can be naturalized to resist challenge and change, or they can make themselves available to challenge and change, denaturalize themselves. That's our interest. We want structural alternatives, but unlike the liberals and socialists of the 19th century, we understand that we should not succumb to a structural dogmatism, and therefore, one of the most important attributes of our institutional arrangements in the economy and in politics is that they facilitate their own revision in the light of experience. So that we don't have to deliver ourselves to them hand and foot, so that we can deny them the last word and keep the last word to ourselves. And that's not a vacuous idea, because given the path dependency, given the materials available to us by way of arrangements and ideas, there's a rather narrow gateway by which to make our present economic and political institutions more experimentalist. And a large part of our effort should be to define the content of this escape. The fifth thesis is the thesis that in this effort we should be attentive to a particular dialectic that has very wide application in the economy and in politics. So the individual needs to be secure in a haven of vital protected interests, immunity, safeguards, and capability ensuring endowments. And we make the individual secure by taking something out of the agenda of short-term politics, protecting it by saying they can be changed only by constitutional supermajorities, surrounding it with an aura of sanctity, and so forth. And that's the familiar discourse of fundamental rights and endowments. But the purpose of that activity, of securing the individual in a haven of vital protected immunities, is to be able to throw everything in the society and the economy open to change, to challenge, to experiment, to organize a storm. And what we have in the conventional liberal discourse of fundamental rights is the part about the haven without the part about the storm. The part about the storm is missing. The storm is not spontaneous. The storm has to be organized. And the institutional organization of the storm is a large part of the object of our discussion here. The dialectic between the haven and the storm is the true aim of our conversation.
That was interesting.
So I must say, I've never seen a more effective rebuttal of Carlyle's view of economics as a dismal science. You were having so much fun with it, right? So I'll just...
The context was actually a mistake of Carlyle's. Carlyle thought that economics justified slavery, and it never did.
And he was talking about the Malthusian
Yes,
aspect
yes.
I mean, a small point and a broader point. I mean, I think the smaller point is that I think when you're looking at these, what I call the universal principles, I think you're torn between two things. You know, on the one hand, you want to argue that they're sort of empty. On the other hand, you know, you want to argue, you're saying that they're consequential, but consequential in a way that seems to undermine the point. Now, I think we agree from the way that you illustrated these principles. I think we agree that they're not empty. So I think that's progress. You also suggested that they're consequential, with which we agree. But I think you've described either thought experiments or historical cases where the consequences were somehow went in a direction that sort of the abuse of power or.
So could I explain a moment there?
Well, let me just go on a little bit. So I think once we grant that these principles are controversial, I think we're sort of 3/4 of the way there, because I think the issue is how can we then deploy the fact that they are consequential in the service of the broader normative agenda that we largely share. So I don't disagree with anything that you said about how sort of, for example, the notion of property rights or rule of law have sometimes or often been an instrument of the powerful, but at the root of accumulation, whether it is accumulation in the service of a minority or a plutocracy, those property rights or the rule of law have served that purpose. And if we understand that link, it suggests a way in which we can recreate property rights or redeploy properties or rule of law in the service of the many. Because it seems to me that if you completely forget, or if you completely want to get rid of that middle column, that it leads you to something like, maybe a kind of institutional nihilism that doesn't put any kind of structure or any way to discipline how you would think about the possibilities of institutional alternatives. So, for example, when you talk about how property rights is in fact not just one thing, or a market doesn't have a natural order, that property rights can be provided in a number of different ways. They can be fragmented, they can be temporary, that they can be centralized or decentralized at different kinds of levels. One way to think about that this is that this indeterminacy of property rights allows so much radical experimentation that there's actually no discipline or no boundaries on that whatsoever. Now, I don't know if that's your position, but if that's your position, I would argue that that is a kind of sort of a nihilistic position, because I would say that in fact there are boundaries or certain discipline to that sort of possible experimentation among different types of property rights, and that those disciplines, the boundaries are provided precisely from the elements of that second column, that we want to make sure that when we're slicing and dicing these property rights over time across people, fragmenting them and so forth, that we're creating a set of incentives that aggregate up to the desirable aggregate properties that we want from the first column. That's sort of the tools that from the economics that comes under the second column. So for example, when you give the example of financial derivatives, yes, that's a very good example of how, in fact, we got the incentives completely wrong by creating a very long chain of control that the people who were writing these contracts or ended up not being the ones who had the incentive to actually monitor what kind of contracts were being written, and therefore we got the financial crisis. Well, maybe we should have been alert to it in the first instance, but we certainly understand it a little bit better exposed to after the fact, because we understand that's a failure of incentives or the alignment of incentives in the sense that I've been using it. In other words, the validity of the second column. Or with respect to sound money, I don't think what's happening right now is the fact that inflation is no longer a first-order problem diminishes the role of that point about sound money. It just means that right now, we're operating in an environment where the forces are in the direction of disinflation and deflation, so that this is that it doesn't impose a binding constraint on the way that we should be conducting monetary policy, but circumstances change. Tomorrow it may very well be a binding constraint. Similarly, the fact that there are these universal principles in the second that might seem contradictory, it's not inconsistent. I agree with you that universality and targeting are in tension with each other. But all that those principles say is that when you depart from those principles, that there are specific costs to be paid. It just alerts you that there are those costs to be paid, so that when you are, if you are departing from targeting and your objective is to use the resources that the public has as efficiently as possible, you're creating a cost in the sense of not necessarily reaching the most deserving or those segments of society which you're trying to reach with your poverty elevation problem. Now, that might come at the compensating benefit that when you move in the direction of universality, it might come in with the compensating benefit that there's another objective that you're fulfilling, namely that of solidarity and of lifting everybody else. But it does make you aware that there might be some cost somewhere else that you're bearing, and that's the whole point of disciplining your way of thinking about alternatives. So my challenge to you is really then to tell us that if you're going to be dispensing with the second column, what disciplines or bounds your experimentalism?
So first let me speak to
Can you answer that question? Because I don't think we've ever discussed that. So I would really like to know the answer.
Yeah, so, but first on this question of it being empty or consequential. So my view is that it is consequential only to the extent that it is false and deserves to be rejected. And then we can save it in one of two ways, either by thinning it down until it ceases to be consequential, or by surrounding it with some counter principle, like the relation of targeting to universalism, which makes completely elastic the relation between the two. Now, I do not believe that this leads to institutional nihilism. I think that that this is the wrong way to give content to the institutional alternatives. We don't need that. And that's why I tried to begin in the last part of my discussion. That is, that starting from where we are, from our historical circumstance, we propose institutional alternatives with the materials we've inherited.
But let's agree on one thing. That is not, the second column is not content. The second is operationalization of the first. Content is the first column, is the objectives that you're trying
No,
to.
I don't agree with your interpretation. I think
Your
what the second
interpretation
column.
of my slides.
Yes, that's right. Your interpretation of your slides. I think that the whole purpose, the whole argumentative purpose of the second column is to create a bridge between the first and the third columns.
That's right.
And to show how the abstract propositions of marginalist economic theory are not entirely empty of institutional significance.
That they can be put in the
Yeah.
service of a normative
That-
content.
yes, and
that,
I'm
that,
saying-
that is described
That's
in,
right.
in the first column.
That's right, and I'm arguing that they are empty of institutional significance, and that it's only by a series of logical equivocations, like this business of counter principles or thinning, that we give them an appearance of institutional content. The world resists, it has reasons to resist. But on my view, that doesn't lead to institutional nihilism. And I would cite in defense of that, not just the abstract arguments I made at the end of my intervention, but the whole argument of the last few weeks, in which I've been proposing things like the alternative direction of the knowledge economy and what it depends on, that in no way appeal to these supposed universal principles.
No, I think the link is that I wouldn't know. I wouldn't know how to move in that direction without the help of the second column. And you claim to know, and that's what I'm asking you. Sort of, what where, and that's the import of my question about the discipline.
So then there are particular arguments, but and this relates to an argument which we haven't had yet. You and I have had it in the past. You think that the economics created by marginalism has a causal content, and I think that it doesn't. I think that when it was rigorous, it was, as the Austrian economists understood, a logical apparatus more than a causal science.
That's a separate question.
No,
Before
but
we
it's
get
related to
but
this
what-
question.
Tell me where is the discipline? What you're substituting. I mean, so your 5 themes that you raised are not.
A way of thinking about structure. So that's the begin. So we don't have, in the form of a generally accepted social theory, a way of thinking about structural alternatives. We have what we have, which is this fragmentary, deconstructed form. I defend a certain way, but there's no way that's generally accepted. And so how should we think of these structures? We shouldn't think of them as the social scientists now think of them, as the residue of best practice, like this evolutionary funnel. And nor should we think of them as the Marxists thought of them, like there's a system that's preset. So it's different from the surface of social life. It resists change. The extent, it has far-reaching consequences. The extent to which it resists change is variable, and it's not a system. So we could call it structure, not system. And all the disciplines that exist furnish us fragmentary instruments with which to think about this, but they don't furnish us something like Karl Marx's theory. That is, there's no generally accepted view of thinking about structural alternatives. That doesn't condemn us to explanatory impotence. And in that circumstance in which we find ourselves, of disorientation in the imagination of structure, we should resist the temptation to find this middle position, which is like a diluted form of Marxism, a diluted form of market fundamentalism. That's not the solution. The solution is courageously to accept the situation that we're in. It does have instruments. It doesn't condemn us to nihilism. And in today's discussion at the end, I tried to give an abstract picture of what institutional thinking looks like in this way. And in the previous weeks, concrete examples that were not condemned to this abdication.
So I think we agree with the last thing you said, which is that in the next few weeks, we're actually going to delve deeper into some of these specific practical domains where we might, where we will revisit this argument.
This discussion we've had today is a discussion that I conjecture occurs nowhere else. So here's the problem. This is obvious. We're talking about the things that are central, but this is not this discussion doesn't exist. So there's a problem in the intellectual orientation.
We ran out of time, didn't have a chance to open it up to the class, but maybe next week we'll start to see if there are any questions or comments about this discussion before we go on to our sort of usual exchange.
Very good. Very good.
Good. The sequence actually is interesting that we started with the knowledge economy before talking about.
Nice sort of like chill